So the Washington Post has been at the center of so many movies and TV shows, framed as a defender of democracy. Think of movies like All the President's Men. This week, its owner, Jeff Bezos, made a decision that surprised a lot of people. Today, is the pop culture narrative about the ideals of journalism still true? I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I think one of the reasons that the Washington Post holds a special place in journalism is that it has had so many of its big moments translated into the realm of pop culture. The story of the paper breaking the Watergate scandal that becomes All the President's Men, that's Robert Redford. That's Dustin Hoffman, man. You know, the story of how it published the Pentagon Papers, that's a Steven Spielberg movie called The Post that came out in 2017. Meryl Streep picked up an Oscar nomination for her portrayal of the paper's legendary publisher, Katharine Graham.
The prospectus also talks about the mission of the paper, which is outstanding news collection and reporting. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And it also says that the newspaper will be dedicated to the welfare of the nation and to the principles of a free press.
Great scene. Everyone should absolutely watch that scene and watch The Post, made by Steven Spielberg. Look, the Post has had a lot of significant moments, right? They made headlines when a month after Donald Trump became president, they adopted the slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." The idea being the Post is a defender of the ideals of democracy. Well, there is a bit of a twist in the history of the paper. This week, its owner, the tech billionaire and Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, issued this edict. The only opinions allowed to appear in the paper's opinion section will have to defend, quote, personal liberties and free markets. He said, if you have a different kind of opinion, take it somewhere else. Siva Vaidhyanathan is here to talk about that and what it tells us about the way that all these tech billionaires are shaping the culture that we consume right now. Siva, welcome to the show, friend.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Listen, I think it's important to hear exactly what Jeff Bezos wrote in that email, so I'm just going to take a moment to just read it. Here's a quote. "We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others." And then he added, there was a time when a newspaper, especially one that is a local monopoly, might have seen as a service to bring the reader's doorstep every morning a broad-based opinion section that sought to cover all views. Today, the internet does that job. Siva, the editor of the opinion section, resigned after that. I'm curious, when you hear that, when you think about like the place and culture that the Post occupies, how much of a departure is this direction for the paper?
It's the latest in a series of steps that Bezos has taken in the last year to rein in his newspaper and turn it, at least in part, to an instrument of propaganda. Bezos has deep needs from the U.S. federal government. He has billions of dollars of contracts with the federal government, both for his upstart rocket company that is way behind Elon Musk's rocket company in terms of federal contracts. And I'm sure Bezos is hoping not to be shut out of those by angering Donald Trump. But the second thing to remember is that Amazon, and therefore Bezos, makes most of its money from Amazon Web Service, right? The process of holding these big servers and processors that deal with most of the data that flies across the internet in the United States. And he has many federal contracts for data processing and data storage, including the FBI and the CIA. So he cannot afford to alienate a president who is vindictive and is operating outside and above the law. And I think he saw that coming. So back when it was time to endorse for president in October of 2016, the Washington Post editorial board was going to do what it had done for many decades, which was choose between the two major party candidates, which of them they thought would be a better president. And Bezos at the last minute ordered that endorsement not be issued.
Right. I think like usually we have these ideas of, okay, when rich people own newspapers, right, they attempt to influence what happens in those newspapers or media organizations. I think like Rupert Murdoch being sort of like the most famous example that people can think of when they think of like about Fox News. Like, you know, the Fox News as an instrument that serves some of the interests of Rupert Murdoch's sort of political leanings. It's not normally this transparent, right? Like even during, Jeff Bezos, reign as the owner of the Washington Post, the Washington Post has sort of like continued to defend the idea that it's like this standard bearer of journalistic integrity. Like I want you to just take a listen to this moment from a Super Bowl ad that they took out in 2019.
Knowing empowers us. Knowing helps us decide. Knowing keeps us free.
But the Post has done a lot to try to say, look, we are at the core of what journalistic sort of integrity means. There is, of course, that idea of democracy dies in darkness. When you think about all this, and then you think about like how maybe more transparent the decision that Jeff Bezos made this time around in terms of the ways that it aligns with his interests, do you see that as directly undermining the credibility of a newspaper like the Washington Post and its role in democracy?
I actually wouldn't go that far, not yet. And here's the reason why.
Yeah.
So far, Bezos has put his heavy hand down on the op-eds and editorial page only. There seems to be no direct meddling with the bigger part of the newspaper, which involves news gathering, commentary,
the
analysis.
Reporting. Yeah.
Right. And cultural reporting, right? He has, for instance, allowed critical stories about his own businesses to run in the Washington Post. Now, let's compare this to the Wall Street Journal, because you brought up Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, and he owns a dozen other papers in Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, right?
Yeah.
And all of these papers take overall a conservative approach to news. There's no mystery about it. Murdoch's never hid his disdain for the sort of mushy middle of the road, neutral approach to journalism. However, the Wall Street Journal still in its news sections does outstanding professional investigative journalism, often putting the powers that be in a negative light, but the editorial page is predictably and actually boringly right wing. And I think that's what we're seeing here. The imposition of boring reading into the Washington Post.
We should say, Siva, like the Washington Post is your local paper. Like you live just outside of DC. Yeah. You've written for this opinion section before. Yep. Do you think this changes how you view the paper? Like, would you write for them now?
I would not. I would not write for its op-ed page. What's really interesting is, look, Bezos said that everything must be in defense of two pillars: personal liberties and free markets. So, hey, I could whip out an op-ed right now in favor of abortion rights and
that's under the personal liberties,
trans rights. Yeah. And, maybe Bezos would be good with that stuff. He seems to have endorsed those sorts of positions in the past. Trump wouldn't like it. Is Bezos going to pander to Trump, or is he going to go with this commitment to personal liberties? I could write about free markets, because you know what? One of the most important things about free markets is that we have competition in industries. And one of the biggest impediments to competition right now is Amazon. It is a behemoth. It is crushing all competition in multiple markets. It is the subject of was the subject of intense antitrust investigations by the Biden administration, which is one of the reasons that Bezos turned against the Democrats. He was sick of being investigated and prosecuted on both sides of the Atlantic for his excesses and abrogations in crushing competition. Hey, I'm all for free markets. I'm more for free markets than Jeff Bezos is.
Well, I was going to say that the letter of Jeff Bezos's sort of edict might be interpreted as slightly different than the spirit of that edict, and like that is obviously like to be tested, right? Like the idea of, okay, because walk with me here, Siva. Like if you and I write about a movie that is critical of capitalism, and that is supposed to go in the opinions section, theoretically under this edict, you couldn't file that review. So theoretically, that does not have a place on the pages of the Washington Post. And so when you kind of think about this, I'm sure someone's listening to this thinking, it is just one legacy paper. How much could it possibly matter? Why do you think this kind of stuff matters?
I mean, look, it matters only in the sense that increasingly in the American public sphere, and I think to some degree the Canadian public sphere, we are seeing fewer and fewer forums that allow for the deep deliberation about serious issues, right? That allow for, that are a place to seek new ideas, enlightenment, challenging of one's own positions, right? And having a polyvocal forum is, as I said, rare, but also essential, right? And I think we're left with the New York Times offering this at various levels of quality. I have lots of problems with a lot of what happens in the New York Times, but it is polyphonic. It does bring in a variety of perspectives in a largely responsible way on its op-ed page. There aren't a whole lot of them. CNN used to host a very interesting opinion section. It stopped doing that last year as well.
Right.
It just decided not to anger people with it, regardless of the proliferation of views. Now, of course, I write for a bunch of publications that do this kind of work, but they tend to be from the left liberal point of view.
Yeah.
And so my work is really only read by people who are going to agree with me most of the time. If and when I do write for a New York Times op-ed or a Washington Post op-ed, I am confident I'm going to get a much more interesting and broad set of readers. And those opportunities for me are increasingly being closed off.
I think the thing that worries me about this story, Siva, is how transparent forums that are supposed to be polyphonic, as you mentioned, forums that are supposed to be hosting, those deep deliberations we're talking about, are increasingly becoming more illiberal, right? Like they're becoming more illiberal in ways that feel transparent and open. And I don't just mean, Jeff Bezos saying, hey, if you've got a different opinion, take it somewhere else. I also mean, Elon Musk buys Twitter for $44 billion and then sort of proceeds to say these opinions will in fact be censored in different ways. Like there'll be community notes attached to them. You're not going to be able to see those things. And so if we're talking about the richest people on the planet being able to more explicitly, I think there's an argument that this was always done a bit more implicitly, but if the idea that this is more explicitly done, where does this leave us as consumers trying to express any form of dissent, do you think?
Right. Look, when we put to the side or look at content management, content regulation, internal regulation by our social media platforms, and I would include Twitter and now the former Twitter X, I would include Facebook and Instagram. The principle just recently was do no harm. Like, let's suppress information or expression that might lead people to believe the wrong things, the false things, the dangerous things about certain diseases, medications, climate science, et cetera. Like, let's suppress falsehoods, let's suppress lies, let's suppress hatred, let's encourage deep deliberation and thoughtful examination based on truth, especially when it came to matters of public health. But in the last year, we have seen Musk and Zuckerberg turn their companies toward the more dangerous information, toward the more hateful information and expression. And it's a rather blatant process of pandering to the current political state of the United States, unfortunately. Bezos isn't quite with them on this, but what's interesting is Bezos' statement is in support of small L liberalism, right? It's in support of personal liberty and free markets, like what John Stuart Mill wanted, right? Yeah. So that should mean if you really believe in personal liberty and free markets, the next sentence should be, hey, come at us and the op-ed page with all sorts of opinions about all sorts of things, because we believe in personal liberties and free markets. And that means a free flow of ideas and rich debate and deliberation. But instead, he then follows those statements with something deeply illiberal. We will not consider anything else. It's kind of bizarre. It actually undermines the very idea of personal liberty and free markets.
I do have to imagine, not to speak for the dead, but I feel like if John Stuart Mill was around, he'd be like, I think you guys might have overshot it on the liberalism here, and maybe the power is concentrated in the other end. But Siva, I got to leave it there, man. I really appreciate your time. Man. Thanks again for being here.
Sure.
Thank you. Siva Vaidhyanathan is a columnist with Slate and The Guardian. He's also a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion, a Thousand Blows is set in the underbelly of London, England in the 1880s. It is about real historical figures whose stories have not been widely told. Hezekiah Moscow arrived in London as an immigrant from Jamaica. He became a famous bare-knuckle boxer. And Mary Carr was the queen of the 40 Elephants, an all-female gang of thieves that terrorized the wealthy. There is no evidence that Mary and Hezekiah ever met in real life, but this show imagines what would happen if they did, in fact, cross paths. Jovanté Anderson and Hanna Flint have watched all 6 episodes in the series. Jovanté, Hanna, welcome to the show, friends. How's it going?
Going good.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Listen, Hanna, I'm going to start with you, pal. How did you feel about the story being told in A Thousand Blows?
You know, I'm always welcome to period set pieces that have diversity. It's been for so long just been a white occupied space. So I really appreciate that. Stephen Knight, obviously the guy who created it, he was behind Peaky Blinders. You know, he's established in this sort of kind of world. And I think the world building it, it's really amazing. I love that it's set in East London, but they built the sets in Southwest London, but in a abandoned brewery. So I think it looks great. It's got an amazing cast, a lot of theatre stars in there, like Erin Doherty, obviously we know her from The Crown. Now she's playing Mary Carr. Look at the range. She could do Cockney and posh. Love it. And we've got Stephen Graham, who's like an iconic. Malachi Kirby is like a rising star. Even like kind of little actors like Daniel May's not a little actors, no little actors, but you know, they've got the real like kind of people who are established in the British TV scene. But I guess for me, I found sort of the characters and the storylines kind of well trodden. It felt like I knew exactly where this is going to go. So after the first episode, where I was kind of intrigued, where we kind of have the arrival of Hezekiah, his kind of dreams and ambitions have kind of quickly been thwarted, and he's facing his first time in the ring against Stephen Graham's kind of toxic masculine sugar. And I was like, oh my God, I want to see them fight. But then pretty much after the second episode, I kind of lost wind for me. It was a bit baggy, a bit kind of a lot going on, but also not really doing anything that really kept my attention.
Okay, I want to come back to that feeling, that idea that the show would leave you feeling that way, but also the idea that so many of period pieces for so long have been, you know, white occupied spaces. Like, hey, listen, people of color existed in the past. We should make some of those TV shows about them. So, Jovanté, I want to talk a little bit about Malachi Kirby, who Hanna just mentioned. He plays Hezekiah Moscow here. Tell me a little bit about his performance. What do you make of his performance?
Yeah, I really enjoyed Malachi's performance. And you know what? I think there's no way to talk about Malachi without also talking about Francis as well. Because what I really enjoyed, was the tenderness, right? There was a real attempt here at portraying tenderness between not just men, but Black men. And, you know, there was the kind of risk of falling into stereotype. Of course, this is a story about boxers, right? It could have easily, very well been about hypermasculinity and violence, which, you know, in some ways it was. But at the same time, there's a real tenderness between them that I think both Malachi and Francis play off very well. The accents, I think, also, they did really good work on. And I think that, especially as a Jamaican person watching, it for me made the experience more enjoyable, but also in a time when these kind of representations of masculinity are necessary, especially of Caribbean masculinity, of Jamaican masculinity. I think they were really solid.
Just to mention, when you say Francis, you mean Francis Love Hall, who plays the best friend. Hall, yes. Yeah, who plays the best friend of Hezekiah in the show. So, Hanna, I want to talk about the contrast of this, you know, the idea of hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity in the show, because the other main character in the show is, of course, Mary Carr. And Mary Carr leads the 40 Elephants, one of England's longest running crime syndicates. And talk to me about the way that this show sort of uses womanhood, and specifically in that character, to kind of like keep that character moving along.
Well, I will say the first kind of entry point of the episode, I love the fact that they use women's pregnancy as a way to rob people. I love the idea that was kind of their con that worked. I thought immediately from the get-go, it's women using their womanhood to trick people and kind of get this false impression, which I think is really great. And I think with Mary Carr, you know, she's a really deep, well-rounded character in the sense we understand where she's come from. how she's had to be under the wings of certain, whether it's a kind of a mother who we see later in the series, or under Sugar. I mean, I do think with Sugar, there's a very like 2D dimension of the masculinity there. Don't think there's much there. But I like the fact that she is also a woman with desires. She's a woman who wants to have sex. She wants to enjoy herself. She wants to have pleasures, but she doesn't want to be beholden to a man. She's inclusive of the women. She's there for them. But, you know, you could easily get into this very much like, we're going to take a male character and then just turn them into a woman, you know,
Right.
Ellen Ripley or like Angelina Jolie Salt. But they've clearly done a lot of work to make her, you know, her vulnerability is something that is not totally taken away. I will say as the show goes on, we see that come out a bit more. And actually, you know, it's about survival and what you have to do. And all of these characters, especially the ones who are in the kind of lower end, the East End characters, they're just trying to survive. And so I think the way that her femininity is used as a guise and a way is undermined. It's kind of like the femme fatale, right? There's
Right.
a lot of elements of that. But rather than her just being a sex object, she's also the brains, the mind, and she actually has a lot of caring spirit in there as well.
Okay, so I just want to just play you guys a scene. This is a late night meeting between the two main characters here. So Hezekiah and Mary Carr hanging out.
This city makes only one promise, that it will kill you the first chance it gets. Strip your flesh as quick as them dogfish.
Think we don't have dogfish where me from? Oh, we have them. Them wear white suits and red uniforms. Me know all about cruelty, Mary Carr. That is a commodity your people saw fit to share with the world.
Jovanté, we have no evidence that Hezekiah and Mary Carr ever met. The show is asking you to imagine that they share the same world and the same sort of environment. What do you make of the idea that they sort of share this story together?
Yeah, so I'm deeply suspicious of the romance at the center of the story, especially because, as you said, there's no evidence that they did know each other. And so I find myself asking, what purpose is this narrative emplotment serving? What does it mean to bring this black and white character together in this interracial romance? And how does it, in the current moment when British Empire, American Empire are all in crisis, right? What does it mean to want to imagine this interracial harmony, right? This interracial romance. And so, yeah, I'm a bit suspicious of it. And, you know, I think as the series, the episodes kind of bore out, I was less, you know, I was willing to kind of see where it would go. But I think in the end, there is still this kind of desire for romance that the series ends up, you know, with, that in some ways feels like it's feeding into a current moment where, you know, oftentimes interracial romance is perceived as a bomb, right, for a lot of the kind of racist colonial violence that people face. So yeah, I'm a bit suspicious of it, but and I also think that because these characters are so large, both Mary Carr and Hezekiah Moscow, I do wonder what you know, kind of series that focused just on their lives would look like. It kind of felt almost like in some ways a DEI 2-for-1, right? What does it mean to kind of smash these two people together that somehow you know, they really deserved more time on screen in their own stories, developing in their own ways. And so, yeah, I'm really suspicious of that.
Hannah, I got to say, I got about a minute left here, but there is a bit of a trend this year in UK TV, which is like real women in history who committed crimes. You know, you have Mary Carr, you have the Price sisters in Say Nothing. There's another new show, Dope Girls, about how women ran drug trafficking after World War I. Sorry. How do you feel about all the proliferation of all these stories? What do you make of this kind of angle kind of coming on all these different shows?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece for Mashable about women behaving badly on screen recently, and it seems there seems to be more of an appetite for allowing women to have the nuances that men are afforded in so many different shows. I mean, what I think is really interesting about all these kind of these specific period shows, and again talking about the past but also reflecting on today. You know, even in that clip that you just played, it's cruelty, how do you survive? That was when it was poverty was super bad. There was a massive gap between the working class and the elite, and you kind of have this empathy for the lengths that people have to go to survive. Today we are facing the worst kind of cost of living crisis in the world, right? There are a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. Even people who 50 years ago might have been able to afford to buy a house can't do that anymore. So I think it's really interesting that we're seeing these disruptive women kind of taking on themselves and going on. So yes, I'm all for it.
Sorry, Pat, I just got to cut you off there. I'm so sorry, but Jovanté Anderson, Hanna Flint, this has been a delight. Thank you for your time and for your energy. Thanks for being on the show today. My name is Elamin. This show's called Commotion. You guys, we'll see you again tomorrow.